Welcome to this new series of the Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie DeRosier and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is located on Indigenous land, the land of the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful for their stewardship of the land and for the ability that we have to continue our work here. The Massey Dialogues are based on the idea of bringing together the voices of experts and the voices of the young researchers. This intergenerational aspect is key to the vision. We want to discuss issues of the day and hear different perspectives. I want to thank the Massey community for the wealth of good suggestions that we have received throughout the summer, and particularly to Keshnos Sood and Michael Valpy and their committee for putting together this fall program. Enjoy today's discussion.
Hello, my name is Michael Valpy. I'm a senior fellow at Massey College, and I'm hosting this session of today's Massey Dialogues. We think the topic will fascinate you. The link between zoonoses, diseases transmitted from animals, and pandemics in humans like COVID-19. The United Nations Environment Program and many leading scientists have called COVID-19 a clear warning shot to humanity in that we're crowding wildlife into excessive contact with humans through destruction of habitat, through farming, mining, forestry, and housing, and through so-called wet markets, live animal markets, that UNEP is called a, quote, a mixing bowl for disease, unquote. Inger Anderson, the executive director of UNEP, pointed out recently that 75% of all emerging infectious diseases come from wildlife. The immediate priority in combating pandemics like COVID-19 to protect people from the coronavirus and prevent its spread, she said, that's the immediate priority. But our long-term response, she said, must be to tackle habitat and biodiversity loss. Never before have so many opportunities existed for pathogens to pass from wild and domestic animals to people. So with that as an introduction, we move on to today's session of Massey Dialogues. And let me say, we're so completely fortunate in this college to be able to assemble experts in just about every field of intellectual endeavor, and today is no exception. After I set the stage for our discussion with our guest, Junior Fellow Gavia Lertzman-Lipovsky will discuss with our guest how humans are increasing their exposure to diseases carried by animals. Gavia is working on her doctorate in evolutionary biology. She's attached to University of Toronto's Mailer Lab, studying how evolutionary history shapes modern patterns of diversity and community structure. As well, she looks at the effects of climate change on populations. And she is a violinist who walked 750 kilometers with her violin through France on one of the main routes of the Camino de Santiago, stopping to play in churches along the way, which I think is a wonderful story. Following Gavia, the conversation will be taken up by Senior Fellow Dr. Diane Sachs, perhaps Canada's most respected environmental lawyers, and one of the tops in the world, and Ontario's former Environment Commissioner. She was appointed unanimously to the post in 2015 by all members of the provincial parliament. During her term, she delivered 17 reports in the environment, energy, and climate change. She holds a doctorate in law from Osgoode Law School and now runs her own consulting firm on the environment, climate change, and energy. She will discuss with our guest what barriers to zoonotic transmissions of governments might that sorry what barriers to zoonotic transmissions that governments might be prepared to put in place. And finally, our guest. We're exceptionally lucky to have with us Dr. Johannes Rafish from the United Nations Environment Program headquarters in Nairobi. Dr. Rafish is the lead author of UNEP's major report on the links between zoonotic diseases and pandemics, which was published this spring. He's an animal ecologist. He's been located in East Africa since 2005. He's worked as program manager for the International Gorilla Conservation Program and now leads the secretariat of the International Great Apes Survival Partnership, known by its delightful acronym of GRASP. Hello, Johannes. Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Could you start by just giving us an outline of your report that you were the lead author of in the spring?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thanks everybody for inviting me to this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak about this report. So you mentioned already that 60% of all known infectious diseases are zoonotic. So these are diseases where humans contract diseases from animals. And to complete, they're also reverse zoonotics. So we can also transmit diseases to animals. And 75% of all emerging infectious diseases are thought to be zoonotic. That's an important topic anyway, but then the COVID crisis prompted UNEP to work on this report and elaborate a bit more on the environmental angle of zoonotic diseases. And that's very complex. There's a lot we know, but there still remains a lot we unfortunately don't know, and we need to research a bit more. So in many cases, we have learned that the degradation of the environment has a link to the emergence and spread of diseases. And that's somehow understandable because often, especially in a biodiverse world and in the tropics, the disease-transmitting vectors in highly biodiverse areas feed on a larger variety of hosts. And many of those hosts are poor reservoirs for the pathogens. But when we end up with monocultures, we cut down the forest, we replace them by monocultures, there's very little diversity left. So the risk that a disease can break out and have a pandemic impact is much higher. But it's not that easy. Unfortunately, there are many other examples too. So there's also indications that by deforestation, we are left with forest fragments, but those fragments can stimulate the evolutionary process in pathogens, and we end up with a higher diversity of pathogens. So this is a very complex, complex environment where more research is needed. So to summarize, the report identified 7 disease drivers. And the first is increasing human demand for animal protein, and we can talk about the exposure a little bit later. The second is unsustainable agricultural practices and intensification. The third driver, increased use and exploitation of wildlife. The fourth driver is the unsustainable utilization of natural resources, a lot linked to land use changes and increasing urbanization. The fifth is increased travel and transportation. I mean, now a disease can travel around the world within hours. Number 6 is changes in food supply. And number 7, climate change. There's also some evidence that a changing climate can actually create more favorable conditions for pathogens. Do you want me to go also into the recommendations of the report, or do you want to ask me some other questions first?
Let me ask you some questions first, and perhaps we can get into the recommendations when you talk to Diane. You mentioned at the outset there's still lots that we don't know. What don't we know? Don't we know? Sorry, just let me finish. I just want to make this a two-part question. What don't we know? And in all the masses of media coverage that have been on COVID-19 since January or February, are we paying enough attention to the zoonotic links to this disease? Or is that sort of being forgotten about in all the noise about the spread of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot we don't know. I mean, in case of COVID-19, there is obviously evidence that bats are the likely reservoir for the current novel coronavirus outbreak, but we don't understand the exact transmission pathway. I mean, there were earlier indications it might have been the market in Wuhan. Most likely the market served as an amplifier, but the transmission happened somewhere else. I can give you a few other examples. In case of Ebola, very deadly disease in many parts of Africa, and 35 years of research, and we know the transmission pathway better. It's bats, but we don't understand the reservoir. There's very little evidence that bats are also the reservoir. So I think we have to invest more in understanding the exact pathways of transmission. And I think it's a little bit human nature. We come when there's a crisis and we want to save lives. That's great. But I think we need to understand what is happening out there. And often in intact ecosystems, we don't monitor wildlife and human health. We don't have a baseline. We don't know what's the situation. Then we start building roads. We start converting the landscape, creating agricultural or farms, large agricultural areas. But we don't monitor along the whole development pathway. So there's a lot of options for new diseases. And we learn that when it's by far too late.
We talk about the wet market in Wuhan as the cause of the coronavirus. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it's more complicated than that. When you, for example, mention a reservoir, what do you mean by a reservoir?
Well, a reservoir is basically, it's a natural condition which is favorable for the pathogen.
Okay.
So where the pathogen can survive for a long time, for a long period. So in case of Ebola, we have an outbreak and with a number of fatalities, and then out of a sudden, Ebola stops and it appears in a different location, sometimes thousands of kilometers away. We don't know how the virus could basically hibernate for such a long period.
Okay. And why does the finger get pointed at bats so often?
Yeah, bats obviously have a super immune system, so they can handle many pathogens, and they are deadly for other species, including humans, but also other animals. And they have a super immune system, which makes them immune. But there's another element which is important. Bats are travel along long distances. So when they carry a pathogen, that can land in an area far away. And I think that is one of the issues with the Ebola disease, which pops up in very different areas in a short period of time, but over long distances.
Okay. And Inger Anderson, the executive director of UNEP, in one interview she gave, blamed the fact that humans are crowding wildlife, crowding animals. What is she talking about? Can you explain to me what she means by crowding animals and why that is feeding into more pandemics?
Yeah, I think there are many examples. The last prominent example was just a few days ago, and I was shocked to hear that in Denmark, they are killing 15 million minks in the mink farms. I first didn't even know that Denmark is farming that many minks. But we do have a problem with a lot of animals in a small, crowded in a small place and with a high exposure to humans. So you also mentioned the example of the wet markets. The wet market is sometimes a little misleading term. I mean, wet markets are observed are seen in many developing countries, not only in Southeast Asia. the terminology or the term simply comes from the fact that these markets are cleaned with water, and sometimes they use ice to keep the meat cold, and especially the seafood. But a wet market does not necessarily have wild meat or domestic meat. It could also be just a food market. So what makes it tricky is when you have a market where people sell domestic meat, wild meat, maybe meat from breeding facilities. Sometimes the breeding facilities in the same spot. Some of the items have traveled long distances that might even come from other countries. And then you have humans in close contact with either fresh meat or live animals, whether domesticated or semi-domesticated. So this is really where a virus can jump from one species to another.
I think then, Gavia, I'll turn it over to you because this is a good time to segue into what you want to talk to Dr. Rafish about. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to be talking to you today. This is really fascinating to me, and I think to many other people. So I wanted to take a moment to dive back into the biology a little bit. So my understanding is that zoonotic diseases have been around forever, for as long as there have been humans or human-like animals. So what makes human behavior special in the last short little while that causes this conversation to be so much more important to have now?
I think it's there are many factors which make human behavior or which have changed, let's say, over the past 50 years. One is we have a much higher human population on the planet. So statistically, there's also a higher risk that we contract new diseases. Then new forms of travel. I mean, we all traveled so much. You can, within a few hours, you can move from one continent to another. We can carry diseases and bring them to remote places, or we go to remote places and get confronted with new diseases which our body and our immune system hasn't seen before. And then the third factor is because we are so many people and because we need so many resources, we basically encroach into the natural environment. So more and more intact ecosystems disappear, and whenever they disappear, we have a degraded environment, but we also have new points of contact between our wild environment or originally wild environment and ourselves. So there's a high risk of contracting diseases or new diseases.
Right. So there's a really important link there between habitat loss and habitat degradation and human expansion. And when I was reading I believe it was the report that you put out, you mentioned non-random biodiversity loss and how when we're destroying the environment, we're also creating ideal environments for weedy species to become highly abundant. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why those particular species are particularly potentially important for transmitting zoonotic diseases.
Yes, thank you. You refer to species like rodents. I mean, a couple of scientific studies have shown that a lot of diseases get transmitted by rodents, and often this is a taxa which increases exponentially when we remove the predators, and that's unfortunately when we alter habitats and more humans move in, we get rid of predators because they're dangerous or they threaten our domestic animals, or they simply disappear because the habitat is not there anymore. And then we have the situation that rodents can transmit diseases, or we have also a number of examples where insects can transmit, and the insect population is also a result of a changing habitat.
Yeah, so that actually reminded me of something else I wanted to ask about, is there's this really complex life cycle of a virus and parasites that move from these reservoir species to hosts and then maybe eventually getting to humans. And you mentioned mosquitoes, and livestock as well are also really important in this transmission process. And so I wondered if you could just maybe elaborate on the importance of livestock sort of at these intermediary zones between human expansion and habitat destruction, sort of what the role is about livestock in transmission of zoonotic diseases.
Yeah, I think it comes in two ways. One is obviously sometimes livestock is still similar to its wild origin, so they are exposed to the same diseases, and they basically jump from wild animals to domestic animals, and from domestic animals to humans. I mean, there are many examples in dogs, wild dogs, and then domestic dogs, and then in some cases it's also dangerous for humans. But there are many other examples. The other thing is often when we have intensive livestock farming, we change our habitats. I mean, a lot of forest has been converted for cattle farms. So it's a new environment, somehow a monoculture, and often this creates favorable conditions for pathogens. So it's both ways: the genetic proximity of domestic animals to wild animals, and then the change of the habitat.
Yeah. So would one solution to be to obviously not have monocultures and separate the livestock out, but would another solution be then to move the livestock away from close proximity to wild animals? Or obviously that wouldn't necessarily work in all cases.
Yeah, I think it's a complex question. I mean, one is what is the best just from the perspective of disease prevention, and one is a more complex question. As an epidemiologist, one would probably say we have to minimize any contact between humans and animals, and that's what a lot is in place right now. When the crisis started, animal markets were banned in many countries. But there's another side to it too. A lot of people, especially in developing countries, depend on wild meat. I mean, it's their source of protein. It's also their source of income. We cannot simply say, don't do it. And there's also parts of the world where there's quite a sophisticated economy around wildlife in Southern Africa. If we take that away, what would be the potential consequence? Most likely conversion to agricultural land. So no wild animals, instead of this, agricultural farms. So we lose the entire habitat. That's probably even worse in the long run. So I think it's a very complex discussion, and decision makers have to balance between the potential long-term impacts, obviously the economy and the livelihood options, and then obviously we have to look into sanitary health precautions, etc. But just a ban itself is not solving the problem. Maybe for a short period of time now to get this crisis under control, but I think we deal with a much more complex issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this is also an issue about conservation. You mentioned earlier about the mass sort of culling of the mink farms. And I wondered how the current pandemic and pandemics in general influence conservation efforts around the world. And I know as a part of GRASP, you probably are very familiar with these issues.
Yeah, I mean, there are huge impacts. And I mean, at the moment, I'm doing crisis management on a daily basis. I mean, you can imagine a lot of great ape areas, conservation areas depend on tourism. And we all have praised tourism, or ecotourism specifically, as an important form of revenue for protected area authorities, but also for communities which try to conserve their land. So no tourists coming, no income. How do you run law enforcement operations? How do you pay your staff? How do communities survive in such a situation? We actually lost a silverback in wind impenetrable national park in Uganda. I think the first since 12 years. And it's just one of the indicators that we really have a crisis now, and we cannot diversify the sources of income overnight. So that needs a much longer period to come up with alternative solutions or additional sources of income.
And because great apes in particular are so closely related to people, to humans, there must be issues and worries about COVID potentially jumping another species and spreading as well, right?
Yeah, there was actually a case of a previous coronavirus form a couple of years ago, and chimpanzees contracted this in Cote d'Ivoire. So we do know that generally great apes are susceptible to viruses from the coronavirus family. We haven't seen that newest one jumping over to great apes, but that's basically because all tourism operations were suspended for many, many months. And now, because economic damage is so huge, some countries have started this very, very cautiously reopened for local and resident tourism, because we need income. I mean, at some point, you don't know what is worse. And the the virus is bad and the disease is bad. But when the economy collapses and you lose your habitat and you lose your animals because of bushmeat hunting, it's also a crisis. So you have to find a way. It's an absolutely crisis situation.
That's really hard. There doesn't seem to be a good solution to that.
Yeah. You mentioned the mink farms in Denmark. This is, of course, it's also a more complex discussion, or potentially discussion. I mean, there's some examples that breeding and farming of wild animals has actually taken pressure from wild populations. When you look at crocodile farming, for example, there are other examples too. So it can be a source of income, and it can reduce pressure on wild populations. It's not always the case, but it can potentially be. So closing those businesses has an economic impact for the farmers who do this, and it might basically move the pressure to another species, another country, another environment. And I think that's one of the things. Our world has become so global. Everything is linked.
Yeah, exactly. Have you heard of cases of people trying to kill off bats or other potential disease reservoirs? Is that also an issue?
Not many, a little bit. There was an incident in Uganda, not in response to the current crisis, but in response to a previous crisis, and they had a bat eradication program in a cave. But actually, they ended up in a worse situation. So they tried to eradicate the bats, and then they saw a new outbreak of the Marburg virus. So it's not that easy. In case of Ebola, a lot of countries actually did do some environmental campaigns and told people, don't kill the bats. It's a much more complex project. And I think most of the Ebola affected countries did this quite well. But what they did is they warned people of eating wild meat because it is a risk that you contract the virus from eating wild meat.
Right. So really the is a holistic sort of thing that operates on many different fronts. So what is one thing, like what is the one take-home message that you want people to understand about biodiversity loss and habitat fragmentation and zoonotic diseases? Like if I'm going to talk to my grandparents, what is the one 30-second thing I should tell them?
In most cases, biodiverse habitat protects us, because a lot of pathogens find many hosts, and many of them are poor hosts. So the risk that we contract the disease is less. So we have to get nature back into its intact form. That's the number one message. Number two is things are more complex. If we want to prevent it in the future, we need to understand this better. So we need to understand baselines in intact ecosystems. And when we think that we can just build a road into the forest and bring in new people and change their habitat, we definitely need to include a health component in our development planning. And this is not there yet. When we plan big infrastructure projects, we look into some socio-ecological safeguards. We don't look into the health angle, but we actually create basically a recipe for disaster.
Oh.
Sorry, I wasn't meant to depress you, but that's a really important point for us, that we really respond to a crisis when it's too late, and we plan big development projects. And I'm happy. I mean, it's good that we have a social and environmental safeguards framework in most organizations. It's great, but I think we make a mistake by ignoring the health angle.
Yeah.
Gavia, thank you for this. Diane, can I bring you into the conversation now? And maybe you can riff off something that Johannes said about keeping nature intact. This is something you've worked for years to do. Go ahead.
Right. No, for sure. Johannes, thank you, and congratulations on your report. Very interesting. As one of the things that really struck me is how similar your recommendations are based on your study of these issues all the way around the world. And the little report that I did 2 years ago to the provincial government in Ontario on the same topics of keeping nature healthy, managing wildlife disease, proper monitoring of what's happening in the wild landscape. And it was really striking to me that I made essentially the same arguments with many of the same statistics, and got absolutely no response. In fact, the things have become even worse since then. So what you've pointed out is a problem we have all the way around the world. And before I was environmental commissioner, I would have thought that these were primarily problems in the poor world, where large numbers of people, fairly low levels of education, low levels of environmental enforcement, government weaknesses. And it's really shocking to me to see that we have exactly the same problems here, that governments here are unwilling to spend the money to monitor nature. They dramatically underfund any kind of attention to wildlife disease. They are unwilling to reduce subsidies to industrial agriculture. We had an example in Ontario where moose populations are plummeting, and moose hunting is very important to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. And one of the big reasons is climate change. Another big reason is habitat loss. And so the government's response was to say, let's kill the wolves. And we know that killing the wolves means more rodents, and as you just explained, fewer wolves equals more rodents equals more risk of disease. So if we have the same problem here in one of the richest provinces and one of the richest and best educated countries in the world, how can we hope to get significant action in protecting nature in the whole world?
Good question. It's true. I mean, these issues have come up for years and years, and the One Health concept has been around for 20 years, and experts have asked the same questions. But I think with that current pandemic, which is really in every single country on the planet, and the rich are affected, the poor are affected, the North and the South, maybe that helps to make some decision makers think that we have to do things differently. And I just give you an example how connected the world is, and that what we decide in the North has a massive impact on what happens in the South and might come back to us. One of the very controversial topics is palm oil, sustainable palm oil. We all use palm oil in many products, in cosmetics, in food, but even in industrial oils. Not using palm oil is probably not a solution, that we would be using soya oil. So about 10 years ago, the European Commission was discussing ways to make our energy greener, and talked about biofuels, and palm oil was one of those, and they tried to create incentives. What happened is that overnight, the palm oil prices were skyrocketing because the palm oil producing countries realized that they can sell more. But in the European regulation, there was no provision for sustainability criteria. Now, 10 years later, they're discussing it again and try to see whether they can basically restrict the import of palm oil. It has to come from certified sources. So what I want to say is that countries in the North, with their own, whether it's subsidies or restrictions, trade restrictions, they have a massive impact on what is happening in the world. And palm oil, again, is a good example because the sources get mixed on the way. Palm oil can come from West Africa, from Indonesia, it gets mixed in China, and then goes to Europe. So everything is linked. And we are part of that
Yeah.
world. I think this is really a wake-up call that we are living on the same planet, and no one is disconnected, with maybe the exception of very few countries. We're all connected, so we need multinationalism, and we need to agree on principles. We don't have a choice.
Well, we don't have a choice if we want to avoid disasters, but that, as you know, lots of governments, including our own here in Ontario, are still choosing things that will bring us disasters. But let's go to another point. You made an excellent argument about the total societal costs of disease and the comparatively tiny costs of monitoring and prevention. But one of the things I observed is, yes, that's true, but the people who pay the costs are not the same people who get the benefits. And that's one of the reasons why we do not see these comparatively small investments made in preventing disasters. The disasters will be borne by somebody else. How do you deal with that in your work?
That's a very important question. And my personal conviction after almost 30 years working on conservation in Africa is the benefits don't go to the people who need them. And what I mean is we still have a lot of wildlife in Africa, fortunately, but we have to make wildlife, and wildlife is part of biodiversity, you have to make wildlife a very viable land use option. And often that's not the case. We have national parks, great for the government and for the tourists, and probably there's carbon benefits and biodiversity benefits. But the people around often don't see the benefits. So why should they conserve the animals when they don't see the returns? So we need to find ways that the people who live with wildlife can participate in decision making and can see the economic benefits. That's just one example. But it's the same. It's, you can take the northern world too. A lot of our policy is based on the influence of the lobbyist groups, and the big companies and the big food producers are very well organized. But who talks to the small farmers? But they're very important in terms of biodiversity because they keep a much more diverse habitat.
Well, right. And are you finding any solutions for that problem, that the voices of the small farmers are routinely excluded and ignored?
We try. I mean, UNEP has a major stakeholders branch, and their job is really to give the minorities, the underprivileged groups, a voice. But it's also strongly on indigenous people, local people, because they have often to live with the problem. They also have to live with climate change, even though they are probably the people who contributed less to greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. One of the things that jumped out at me in your report this week is your emphasis on institutions, on strengthening the institutions that are necessary to protect nature. And again, what we see right now in Ontario is a vicious attack on exactly those institutions, precisely because they have been effective in slowing the selling off of wetlands and woodlands and agricultural land to developers. And so we now have a government that is very favorable to developers and is hollowing out our environmental laws and weakening our conservation authorities so that it's harder to protect those kinds of places. So again, given that we've seen that sort of change under President Trump in the United States very extensively as well, what will countervail this enormous pressure to weaken these institutions so that the rich can make more money in the short run? How do we countervail that pressure?
I think transparency is an important element. There have been a couple of online platforms, both on the in the mining sector, but also in the palm oil sector. So the palm oil transparency toolkit, I know it a little bit better, but it's an excellent way of monitoring whether the companies registered under the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil actually comply with the legislation. And with an online and transparent online toolkit, violations become public very easily. The same can be done on biodiversity. There are also several approaches of making the mining sector more transparent, because as we all know, often mining has disastrous impacts on biodiversity. So I think with modern technology, social media, connectivity, remote sensing with satellites, we have options of basically make it public when companies don't comply with the law.
And then what happens? I mean,
Okay,
even if it's
sometimes they do
public.
comply with the law, but it's still a very negative impact. So sometimes they have the right papers, but they still have a devastating impact. But this can become public.
Right. And when it becomes public, what have you seen happen? Sometimes terrible things get made public and still nothing happens. Are you seeing a strong response from buyers?
That's complex. I think it depends on the commodity. So if I take coffee or cacao, a lot of people think it's some kind of a luxury, and they're able to pay a bit more, and they hope and they try to buy certified products, a certified or fair traded chocolate. But with palm oil, people don't have that feeling. We actually have certified palm oil, which doesn't get sold for a premium. People are not willing to pay that extra. And maybe it has to do with the fact that we cannot yet trace the entire chain properly. Ideally, you could go to a supermarket and use a barcode and find out whether it's good palm oil or bad palm oil. And then you can actually give the final consumer a lot of power over what they would be buying.
Are we getting close to that?
No, but there are ways. I mean, there have been pilots on barcoding palm oil products, and you go with your mobile phone and you know it's a good or a bad product.
Well,
But I think there's a combination of certification, law enforcement, transparency, and consumer awareness goes into the right direction.
Right. Now, one of the things I noticed you called for was to bring climate and environmental perspectives into health work and into the One Health policy framework. So whose job is it to do that? Who is doing that?
I think one of the discoveries in the report, but I mean that was known, is that within the One Health framework, often the environment is the underrepresented sector. I mean, as I said, when there's a crisis, the medical doctors come to save life. If it's livestock related, the veterinarians come, but we don't understand the full mechanism of the spillover from a wild population to domestic animals and finally to humans. So that's important. As a first step, UNEP will be joining the tripartite alliance with FAO, WHO, and OIE. That's important. And hopefully gives us a mandate and a niche what we can do in the environmental, bringing in the environmental dimension to One Health. And finally, I think it's a responsibility of all sectors. Environmental training for public health experts, for example. And for us as environmentalists, working with the public health sector, strengthening the public health sector in remote rural areas, in developing countries. It's a big job, but I think we have to include the environment.
Right. You mentioned a number of acronyms that not everybody might know, but you were talking about the World Health Organization, I mean, I didn't catch all the others.
Yeah, and the Food and Agricultural Organization.
Right. What do you see? I mean, we have a number of groups within professions, and particularly within health professions, who are focused on environmental issues as well as human health. So people like the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. We see small groups developing in other professions, nurses, architects, engineers, dietitians, and so on. What do you think those professional groups could be doing that would make a difference on your key recommendations?
I think one of the critical areas for us is, I mean, we are the conservationists, the environmentalists, and often very remote from the health sector. And when I see how the veterinary associations, also medical doctor associations, reach out to people and reach out to rural areas. If we could include the environmental component in these outreach activities and reaching out to thousands and 10,000, 100,000 of people with the help of those established mechanisms, that would make a big difference.
Well, a lot of your recommendations, as I say, really seem to be speaking to the developing world, but they're equally applicable here in Canada. Have you seen any sign that Canadian regulators are paying attention and are going to move in this direction?
I think I have to admit that I'm not that familiar with the situation in Canada, but I do know that we have received a lot of response to our report from many countries, and in Europe at the moment, Germany and France are leading a dialogue on One Health. Many other countries are following. So I can see that we get traction in the developed world too.
All right. Thank you very much, and congratulations again on your report. Gavia, did you have any other questions about the recommendations?
No, I don't think so. I think that all makes a lot of sense. It sounds really complex, and like most issues, operates on so many different fronts.
Right. One of the things,
Yep.
Johannes, that we're getting a lot of attention to these days is how can we address problems in a way that solves more than one problem at once? What do you think is the key area of your report that can help us solve more than one problem at once?
I do think that the message, building back better and keeping the environment intact or restoring the environment, has a lot of benefits. Obviously, it's a barrier or a buffer that hopefully we will see less outbreaks of dangerous diseases. But also we have biodiversity benefits, we have carbon benefits because it's better for the climate, and we avoid greenhouse gas emissions. And it also, it creates green jobs. So I think by tackling this and investing in restoration, and there's the UN decade on restoration, they are getting more and more traction and investment. This is a good vehicle to tackle multiple things at once, while not ignoring the health perspective in it.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain to our audience what the One Health framework is? Your report mentions it, I know, a number of times, but can you just define it for us?
Yeah, the underlying principle is what is good for animals is good for humans, and it's also good for the environment. And it was originally more driven by medical doctors and veterinary scientists. And then the realization came that the environment plays an important element. And so it's really bringing the three disciplines together: human medical sciences, veterinary sciences, and environmental sciences. There are some similar concepts as planetary health or eco-health, but I think this is basically the principle for One Health.
I know your report is online. Just give me the formal title for it so that people in our audience can look it up.
Preventing the next pandemic, zoonotic disease, and how to break the chain of transmission.
Preventing the next pandemic. Zoonotic disease. Yes, and what's the rest of it?
And how to break the chain of transmission.
Good.
Johannes, I think it would be helpful for you to explain the word zoonotic. That's not one that most people are going to know. They're not going to know how to spell it, and they're not going to know what it means.
So zoonotic disease is a disease humans can contract from animals. And to make it more complex, they also reverse zoonoses, so we humans also transmit diseases to animals. And that's why we are very concerned with great apes, that when tourists and scientists come close to the animals, that they can, and they often do, pick up respiratory diseases in particular.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about what institutions can do. I was wondering if there's anything we as individuals sitting here in Toronto that we can do to try and think about preventing the other pandemics or zoonotic disease transmission?
Probably something of all of the different points I mentioned. I mean, obviously now we're in the middle of a crisis, and I think we have to watch what we are doing and reduce the risk of disease transmission by wearing masks and reducing our contacts, social distancing, all this. But I think in general, keeps the environment healthy. So I mean, we all can look what is our energy consumption. What can we do for conservation? We can help some NGOs. We can be more responsible what we consume. So is it a fair traded chocolate, or is it just a normal chocolate? How do we deal with palm oil? Many things.
Johannes, I mean, the basic message that keeping predators alive protects us from disease because they eat the rodents, that makes sense to me. But I think some people would hear that and say, well, okay, why don't we just kill all the rodents ourselves? What do you say to that?
Well, there's a few examples where they really try to eradicate bats or rodents or other animals. They've been very successful. I mean, there's scientific evidence that often it triggered other diseases. What we need is more diversity, more species diversity, not less.
Is it even possible to kill all the rodents?
I don't think so. I mean, they had huge campaigns in Australia years ago because of all the invasive species, and they're still struggling. So I'm sure it's very difficult.
Yeah, we need the Pied Piper.
This has been most informative, and you've been wonderful.
I think, I mean, most of the recommendations came up. I had a specific recommendation section, and all these points came up in our discussion. Maybe as a last point, is it's cheaper to invest in nature and to prevent disease than to respond when it's too late.
Great.
That's fair.
Thank
Michael,
you. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Maybe I can direct people to my report.
Please.
It's called Back to Basics. And I have, the Auditor General broke the links, but I still have it on my website, sacsfacts.com, under reports. And it's the 2018 Environmental Protection Report to the Ontario Legislature.
Good. That's Sax Facts, SAXEFACTS.
.com, under the reports
.com.
page, and the report is called Back to Basics.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all three of you. You've been just wonderful, and you can tune us out.